Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about one of the fundamental exercises in a gym. This movement makes up so many things that we do, and so it's really important that we talk about it. And if you are new to the gym and you're feeling like a little unsure about what's going on or how you do things correctly, learning this movement, the hip hinge, is going to be one of the first things we need to do, and hopefully it'll help you go into the gym feeling a little bit more confident. It looks quite simple, but when you're a beginner starting out in the gym, sometimes this can be one of the most complicated things that you learn. So we're going to talk about it. I'm going to start from the ground up and hopefully get you hip hinging by the end of this video. Now, I am in a gym in this demonstration. You can do most of these things at home, okay? So you can learn how to do it at home in the safety and comfort of privacy, and then go into the gym learning these beautiful movements and going and kicking ass like you were meant to. Other than that, we're going to get straight into it, guys. I'm going to show you how to hip hinge. I'm going to give you the cues that I would give my clients or that I give the beginners and the young athletes that I work with every day. The hip hinge is called the hip hinge because the movement is initiated by your hips. So starting with your feet, you're going to have your feet hip width apart. That's going to give us a really solid base. It's going to make sure that we're balanced and that we're strong. You have a soft bend in your knees, and that bend is not going to change. And then, like I just said, you're going to initiate a movement backwards with your hips, reaching backwards as far as you can with your hips until your hands are just below your knees, and then you're going to stand back up. The next tricky part is one of the really common mistakes. The common mistake is that people don't maintain their back in this nice and neutral position as we go into the movement. So instead, what you'll see people do is that they'll reach back with their hips, but their back will collapse alongside them. And that is not what we want. We want our hips initiating the movement. So it'll be a nice reach backwards with your hips while maintaining a neutral spine. Now, these cues like feet hip width apart or a neutral spine are really good practices for a variety of exercises because it gives us a really solid base and it makes sure that we're at a lower risk of injury. Now, there's of course some nuance to that, but that's not for the scope of this video. Another really common mistake with the hip hinge is initiating the movement by your knees first, and that is not something we want to do because it's not called a knee hinge, is it? It's called a hip hinge. So this is what it might look like if it's done incorrectly. Your knees will bend first, and that's how the movement will go, and then your hips will come in, and that is not what we want. See how clunky that looks? So when you're learning, it can be a really good thing to try and film yourself and see what it looks like. Compare it against people who've been doing it for years. See the differences between what you're doing and what they're doing. If you have a look at me, my hips are not actually dropping all that much. They're just sliding backwards, reaching back, and then they're coming back up, but they're not dropping down too much. And that's how you know you're doing it correctly. If you're struggling to get your back in the correct position, there's a few things we can do. Number one, I've heard the cue of squeezing an orange with your armpits, but what that really means is to keep your shoulders down and back. That'll set up our upper back to be nice and tight. Another thing that you can do, you can try and hold a stick alongside your back. Maybe you could do this one with a friend because I struggle to do it by myself. But whenever you've got a stick alongside your back, you're going to use that as feedback. So when you lower yourself down, your back doesn't change position. You can see my back is a little bit arched, but it's quite neutral, so that's okay. It's not excessively arched. As long as you're not going excessively rounded and you're not initiating that movement with a rounded spine, then you should be in the clear. So having that pole there can act as a little bit of feedback so that you're aware of what you're doing, and if your back changes or if you feel a different part of your back touching the pole at a certain period of time. Another way that you can try and help cue yourself into getting the right movement of your hips is by standing in front of a wall. Then I want you to think about trying to push the wall away with your hips, or you're trying to reach towards the wall. I've heard other people use the cue of close the car door with your hips. So I mean, it's really up to you to pick and choose what cue resonates with you and what helps you to get into this correct position. See how once my knees have that initial softness, they stay quite still, and then I'm reaching back, tapping my hips on the wall and coming back up. You don't need to go much lower than your hands just beneath your knees, because if you were doing an exercise like a Romanian deadlift or anything like that, that's about the end range of motion that we need. You can go lower, but the important part that we want when we're hip hinging is that we don't want our shoulders to ever go below our hips. Another way that we can cue getting those hips backwards is if you were to put a band around your hips and attach it to an anchor point. That band is going to be pulling your hips back. Now, this can be a little bit tricky to balance when you take off the band because you're used to pulling forward, but it can be a good little way of starting us off and making sure that those hips are the first thing to break. Once you get comfortable with the basic basics of that hip hinge movement, then we can explore a variety of other gym exercises that you might have heard of. So for example, we could do a kickstand hip hinge. I think it's also called B stance. With this, I'm still starting with my feet shoulder width apart, but then I'm taking one foot back and I'm putting it up on my toes so that it takes less weight than the foot that's in front. Then going to go through the same movement. So the foot that is in front is doing the majority of the work. Now for me, on this one, you can see that I do bend my knee a little bit more. That's just what's more comfortable for me, but it's still a hip hinge movement. My hips are initiating that movement. When you get comfortable with kickstand hip hinges, then you can begin to add some weight. I find with beginners that one of the best ways for you guys to learn how to hip hinge with a weight is by using a kettlebell or using a single dumbbell if you wanted to. This, what I'm holding right here, is a kettlebell. So you can see I'm standing with my hips shoulder width apart. I'm holding that weight in between my legs. My shoulders are down and back, and that's keeping my upper back nice and tight. And then I'm going to initiate that movement with my hips, keeping that neutral spine until I'm just below my knees and back up. So you can see whether there's a weight or whether there's nothing, my movement looks pretty much exactly the same. The kettlebell is a really useful tool for this because it falls straight down. And this is what we want when we're using weights. Because if you let that bar or that kettlebell drift away from you, then that puts way more pressure on your lower back. And that's not something that we want. You could also do a kickstand or a B stance hip hinge using the kettlebell. You can put one arm out to the side. You can play around with which arm you load it with. I prefer opposite hand to leg in front, or contralateral loading, which just means opposite side. All the same principles apply. Neutral spine, feet hip width apart, strong core, shoulders down and back. And of course, leading with the hips. When you feel comfortable with that, we can go back to that pole that I had earlier, and this is going to be in place of a barbell. A really key point to notice if you start to use a barbell with your hip hinge is that this is now going to be called a Romanian deadlift. Did the Romanians come up with it? I don't actually know, but that's what we call it. Really important when we're using the weights is that you want to keep that bar or that implement as close to your body as possible the whole time. That's why you'll sometimes see people chalking up their legs or their shins so that the bar doesn't scratch them. But if you're wearing leggings, you should be okay. We're keeping it nice and close to us by keeping our shoulders down and back. You can see here when I'm doing it incorrectly, I'm losing that neutral spine and I'm reaching down, and there's way too much bend in my knees for a hip hinge movement. When you begin to use weights, another really common mistake is using your arms to pull up the weight. You can get away with this when you're using lighter weights, but as soon as you move into heavier weights, if you have movement in your arms and you're pulling, you're putting yourself at risk of injury because our biceps and our arms just aren't as strong as our legs and our back, which is the primary muscles being used in a hip hinge. So you want to keep those arms nice and long, loose, shoulders down and back. Don't want to bend them to pull the weight up. This is eventually what you'll get to when you're progressing that movement a little bit more, is that we can add as much weight as we want and see, ooh, look at those hamstrings go. You're reaching back with your hips and coming down. You could then turn this movement into a rack pull, Romanian deadlift, which is what I'm doing here. As a large part of my hip replacement recovery is because of these Romanian deadlifts. Reaching back with my hips and standing back up. See how I'm keeping that bar super close to my body. When you move past that, the next thing that we can get into is by using the hip hinge movement to do other exercises like a bent over row. So if you have a look here, I'm initiating the movement top down. I'm hinging at my hips, getting into a nice strong position and holding that neutral back, holding that hip hinge the entire time. I'm not bending at my back there. I'm not bending at my knees to get the movement. I am hinging at my hips and then pulling up towards my body. That is how we can use the hip hinge and why it's such an integral part of so many different movements. Here's an example of me doing the bent over row with the bar, and you can see I'm trying to maintain that hip hinge position the entire time. So generally, a good rule of thumb is if you feel yourself slipping out of that position, or if you're having any change in that posture, that's when you want to rest or you pushed a little bit too hard. Here's a single arm bent over row, which is a different movement because I'm not starting top down, but it's just showing you the importance of being able to break properly at the hips for a variety of different exercises. And if you don't believe me, here's Callum doing a Romanian deadlift. This is a hip hinge movement, but see how he started from the floor and now he's pushing up, and now he's going to begin his Romanian deadlift by hinging at the hips, going just below his knees, or he's going pretty much parallel because he's strong, and then back up. Hopefully that gave you some insight into how important a hip hinge is. We use it in our Olympic lifting, like the clean and jerk and the snatch. We use it in bent over rows. We use it in deadlifts, trap bar deadlifts. We don't use it in a squat. So if somebody tells you a squat is a hip hinge, Squat is not a hip hinge because the knees and the hips move at the same time. They bend at the same time, and that's not what we want when we are hinging. If you can hinge properly, that will save you so much time in the gym. It's worth focusing on and getting right before you even step into the gym, which is why I wanted to make this video, to show you that there's so many things that you can do at home so that you go into the gym feeling more confident and ready to take on the exercises that are there. I think that's all I've got to say for now. I could honestly talk about this movement and give you cues galore, which I think I've kind of done here, but I'm trying to keep it brief because I know that's not what everybody wants to hear. But hopefully this amount of detail will be a great place for you to start off, and if it helped, please do let me know down below. I hope you all have an amazing week ahead, and get hinging, guys. We want strong hips, we want happy legs, happy back. Oh, beautiful. I'll see you guys soon. Bye. Don't forget to like and subscribe.